This is the hour we stand, this is the hour we fight. Not the hour for cowards, time to fight for our rights. And I ain't running no more, I'm standing 10 toes down. Too much at stake right now, it's just blood in the ground. Pick a side, no more, straddling the fence. You either hot or cold, you either bashful or bold. Brother Cliff, BVM, best believe that I've been listening. The rebirth of a movement, Black Power, revisit. Black Power, we back, you either lion or lamb. Black Power, we back, you either foe or fam. Black Power, we back, make sure that you're listening. Black Power, we back, Black Power Revisited. What?
Welcome to Black Power Revisited. Sometimes I could just sit here and listen to that song all day. I'm your host, Cliff Albright, and of course, Black Power Revisited is the show where we talk about Black Power. What is it? How do we get there? How do we know that we're getting closer to it? This week, we mark the 1-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd. And one of the many things that happened during that time period, during the protests of summer, was that we saw a marked high across the country in terms of opinions about Black Lives Matter, right? That the notion, the words, the phrase reached a higher level of acceptance than had ever been the case before. Of course, since that time, since the quieting down of some of the rebellions that were taking place, so has some of the support for Black Lives Matter. But be that as it may, this is a proper time, this is an appropriate time, this is a timely moment to have a conversation with none other than Alicia Garza, one of the 3 co-founders of Black Lives Matter, also the creator and principal of Black Futures Lab, host of her own podcast, Lady Don't Take No. If you haven't had a chance to check it out, you need to. And in addition to that, best-selling author of her book, The Purpose of Power. Here's our conversation. All right. I am so excited. It is not every day that you get to interview somebody who really doesn't need an introduction, but what the heck? I'm going to go on and do a little introduction anyway. I'm so excited and honored to be talking to friend, comrade, colleague, Alicia Garza, one of the co-founders of Black Lives Matter, co-founder and principal of Black Futures Lab. We'll get into that in just a minute. Author of The Purpose of Power, along with other works. And so let me welcome Alicia. How are you?
Oh my gosh, I'm so excited to be here. Thank you, Cliff, for inviting me. I'm feeling good. I'm feeling hopeful, and I'm feeling ready to kick some butt.
Hey, let's do it. Well, let's get right into it. Usually I start off by asking people, before we even get into the details of everything of the current work, I ask how you came to be in this work, right? Because I'm always interested. Some people were born into a life of activism, right? Activist parents. Some people were born into the movement. Some just discovered it a couple of years ago, right? So I'm always interested to know, like, what was your on-ramp? And in this case, I feel like I kind of know it because you talk to some detail in your book about, kind of your childhood, the issues you faced when you were younger. But you tell us, how did you get involved in this work? What was the thing that made you say, this is the kind of work I want to dedicate my life to?
Yeah, well, I was not born into a political family. And in fact, I think I politicized my family. But I started out in activism, and I'll clarify that in a second, when I was 12. I got really involved in a fight around reproductive rights. And it was basically, to keep it short and sweet, a fight about whether or not our school nurse's office could allow condoms for free and regular and unfettered access. And I grew up in a pretty liberal community, but you would probably not be surprised that people started hand wringing and pearl clutching. And this was, of course, in a context where there was a national conversation happening about morality, about sexuality, a conversation that was really driven by the conservative right. And it's one that we see play out today. Needless to say, we won the campaign to get condoms in school nurses' offices. And I think a couple of things, lit a fire for me. One was winning, and the other was this push around whether or not everyday people who are impacted by issues get to speak for and decide for ourselves what is most helpful, most useful, or whether someone else gets the right to speak on our behalf, to shape our lives, to make the rules that organize us. And I continued on in that work for many years. I actually spent probably about 12 or 15 years in the reproductive rights movement. And I got really disillusioned, Cliff. I'll be honest with you. Once I started learning about the impacts and the ways in which race and class and gender kind of shape our lives, not just from my own experience, right? But also, diving more into case studies from throughout history, diving more into political history and political theory, I got really disillusioned with that work. And I decided that what I wanted to do, instead of being an activist, instead of being somebody who, individually cares about something and might take action on a thing that I care about, I decided that what I wanted to do instead was to be an organizer. And the way that I got kind of politicized in that work in particular was after I graduated from college, I did a program here in Oakland called the School of Unity and Liberation, Soul Summer School. And it was a program that took young people of color from across the country, trained them in organizing methodologies and skills alongside political education, and then placed you in a grassroots organization to actually do that work. So it wasn't just studying it, it wasn't just observing it, it was actually doing it. And I spent a summer organizing largely Black and Latino residents in East and West Oakland around gentrification and also around public safety issues. And our task, right, was to organize 100 people to a house meeting about gentrification over the course of the summer. And I did it. And it required sitting on porches, sitting at kitchen tables with folks. I got locked in a couple crack houses, and those are funny stories for me. But you really learn, how to tap into the things that our communities long for and how to activate what I call the drive to be the superhero in your own story. So not waiting for somebody else to act on your behalf, but knowing that you yourself, in relationship with your neighbors and people in your community, have the power to reshape what is happening in your community.
It was interesting reading that part of the book where you were talking about, especially the gentrification movement that you were part of, because it made me reflect on, sometimes you got people who, and I'm kind of like this, as well, the people who the first issue that they were really, indoctrinated on or really got your experience on, whether it's for you reproductive justice or the gentrification battle. And yet here you are where you're so identified with another issue, right? Obviously related, we're dealing with issues of racial justice and power, et cetera. Sure. But, it's just interesting to see the path that we take, where the thing that we are deeply embedded in at the beginning of our organizing careers, is not necessarily the thing or the space where we wind up making arguably the biggest impact, in your case, literally world shaping impact. So that was interesting. And let me add this, because we're having this conversation, but I really feel like I've been having a conversation with you for like the past week and a half, because I was listening to the audiobook version, which you yourself narrate. Sometimes people get other folk to narrate, but it was your voice. And so like I've had your voice in my ear for the past week and a half.
Right on.
Yeah. But so we're talking about power, right? Black Power Revisited. And in chapter 18 of the book, which is titled In the End, Power, you start off with a very simple sentence. Today, I'm obsessed with power, Black power to be specific. So just tell us, and this is a question that I'm asking everybody, what does Black power mean to you?
Well, for me, Black power is the ability to make the rules and shape the rules. It is the ability of Black communities to determine who gets what, when, where, and why. And in the book, I really wanted to make a distinction between power and empowerment. And especially for Black folk, I feel like we get wrapped in these narratives that if somehow we just believed we were better, then things would change. And I think at the root of that, right, is an assessment that what's wrong in Black communities, what is missing from Black communities, is really a function of individual effort or achievement, as opposed to rules that have been rigged against our communities for generations. And if we understand the difference between power and empowerment, power being the ability to shape the rules, to make the rules, to shape the story of who we are and who we can be, to decide where resources go and where they don't go and why, and to also levy consequences, right? When the people that we elect to represent us don't move our agenda forward, versus looking in the mirror and feeling good about yourself, right? Versus self-esteem, right? Then we understand that we are not only in a fight for our lives, but we also understand that the things that we do to fight for our lives have to shift in order for the conditions in our communities to shift. And so for me, Black Power is about closing the gap between who's making the decisions and who they impact. And it's also about, being able to be the rule makers and the rule breakers. And I feel like for me, when I talk about Black Power, it may be a little bit different than I think how most people think about it. Look, I grew up in a family, like I said, that was not political. And so I also talk in the book about how I felt like I missed out on all the movements for change coming up. I was like, wait a minute, there was a civil rights movement, there was a Black Power movement. And in the 80s and 90s, when I was growing up, it didn't feel like there was any of that. So I guess for me, what I learned about Black Power, right, was that it was disruptive. I learned that it was violent. I learned that it was complicated, sometimes corrupt. And a lot of the ways that I learned about Black Power growing up had a lot to do with being at the table and patronage politics, right? Where it's like very transactional. And as long as you give us money, as long as you give us jobs, right, we're going to give you a stamp on whatever it is that you're doing in our communities. And through the process of becoming an organizer and doing that work for a long time, what I realize is that it's not just about being at the table, it's about setting the menu. And if we don't set the menu, then we are always kind of moving somebody else's agenda and hoping that it's going to be good for us. I believe that our communities are the experts around the things that we need in order to live better. It's people that live in public housing that hasn't been rehabbed in 3 decades, right? That understand the best what needs to happen to public housing. It's people who are living next to toxic sites and being impacted by the health issues that arise from that understand best, right, how to shift that. And to me, that is really power. It's putting people who are directly impacted by whatever issue you want to call it in the driver's seat to determine how our communities get reorganized in such a way, not just that our lives get better individually, but that all of our lives change collectively and permanently.
You talked about for a moment there. You talked about like some of the stigma associated with Black Power,
Yeah,
right? That you were
right.
trained, and not just you, me, everybody, right? We're trained that it was disruptive, that it was violent, that it was negative. You even had old boy Bill Clinton in the midst of John Lewis's funeral talking about how the movement went wrong it went too far towards Stokely, which in essence was saying too far towards Black Power, right? And so, we've got all these stigmas and everything. And, I just wonder how you deal with, and even just saying Black Lives Matter, is like, oh my God, that's a controversial statement. Like, how dare you say Black Lives Matter? So if the notion that Black Lives Matter
Right.
is
Right.
scary and controversial, that, oh my God, Black Power is like, that's a cuss word.
That's right.
How do we navigate the stigma and the everything that's been associated with the notion of Black Power, building Black Power? How do you deal with that? How do we deal with that?
Well, for me, it's been a learning process, honestly. And I think some of it is about mentorship that I've had that was unapologetic about our power and building our power. And then some of it is a daily process where we have to force ourselves to not just reimagine what's possible, but also deconstruct everything that we've been taught about what our potential is. And for me, Black Lives Matter is a great example of the work that we've had to do that. Now everybody talks about Black Lives Matter this, Black Lives Matter that. I was driving on the freeway the other day and I was in traffic and I saw this big billboard that said Black Lives Matter. And I was like, but this billboard is right above a homeless camp where 100% of the people in that camp are Black, and they're living underneath the freeway that I'm sitting in traffic in. And so, some of it I think is also about us telling each other different stories about our potential and our power. When Black Lives Matter first started, and when I first kind of started talking about Black Lives Matter, I was really talking to us. Cliff. And, we've gotten a lot of critiques over the years about, well, we already know Black Lives Matter. This is for white people. I was like, it's actually not. We, and by we, I mean Black folk, have some conversations that we need to have with each other about what that actually means. And the way that we have been taught and the stories that we've been told don't make us the protagonists in our own stories, right? There's always a superhero. And sometimes that superhero is Black and sometimes it's not. Bill Clinton, I think, is a great example, right? We were loving on Bill Clinton as he was locking up our people, as he was whittling away the safety net, and I might say throwing sticks of dynamite into it. But we loved him, right? Because he played the saxophone on television, because he seemed to be comfortable with us and he didn't seem like he was afraid of us. But at the same time, the policies he was championing, him and his wife, were not only deeply regressive, but they were deeply harmful to our communities. And I feel like there's something in there about infrastructure that's important for us to touch on. I spend most of my days and most of my time, and I know you all do too. I'm trying to be like y'all one day. I spend most of my time trying to think about, what do our communities need to not feel inferior to other communities, and to also be able to achieve and actualize our own potential and power. And I'll tell you, as much as we like to strut around and talk about Black power, it's scary to us too. like the notion, right, that we don't have to depend on somebody else to make those decisions for us. The notion that we deserve a lot more than what we're getting. The notion that we deserve to be powerful in every aspect of our lives, for some of us, is a foreign concept. And I think the methodology that we employ at the Black Futures Lab, and also just through our organizing, is we invest in our communities. And we do that in a way that isn't like the way that funders invest in us, right? Which is like, we'll give you some money and then we're going to move our own agenda and we're going to make sure you are pushing our agenda, and I've told people this to their faces, so there should be no new information. But we also require that we tell different stories about us. If you look at all of our materials, right, we project images of our communities that are real and authentic, not the college brochure type of pictures, right? Where we're all put together. We put out a lot of stuff where we're not put together at all, right? But we still see beauty and potential in that. And then finally, Cliff, we're unapologetic about being concerned about Black people. And it's not because we think Black people are inherently better than anybody else. It's because we understand that if a multiracial democracy is possible, right now, Black people are deeply underorganized. And so there is no multiracial democracy without Black people. But if Black people ain't at the table with our own demands and our own concerns that are then connected and related to the concerns of other people who have been marginalized and dispossessed, then we won't be able to achieve the things that we are striving for and that we long for. So those are some of the ways we do it. We look specifically at policy that will impact Black communities positively, knowing that when Black folks are good, everybody else has a chance to be good. We train our communities to have the tools we need to be powerful. So we take the middleman out. We know how to write policy. We know how to move policy, and we know how to implement it, but we need some support in being able to do so. And then the other thing that we do, right, is we talk directly to us about us. And we do not use messages that are negative or that blame us for systems that we didn't create. We don't believe in messages that say things like, if you don't vote, your voice doesn't matter. That's not true. A lot of people don't know what voting gets them, right? And so we have to actually say, yeah, this thing is totally messed up, but we have the potential to change it and reshape it so that it is better, not just for us, but for everybody. those are a couple of the methods that we use in order to kind of shift those dynamics of patronage politics, or, making sure that only brothers are at the front, or making sure that we don't talk about queer communities or trans communities. Like, we talk about everybody and we make sure that we understand that Black is multifaceted, it's layered, and we know that through our lived experience, but we try to create political space where that is the norm, right? Where we can be three-dimensional human beings and we don't have to worry about what other people are going to think about how we show up. We just try to create political space where we show up as we are and we encourage the best of what we have to offer.
You touched on so many things that I wanted to circle back to, because you talked about the multiracial democracy. And then as you were just ending there, you talked about the inclusivity, right? And that's something that I think shocks some people, surprises other people, right? Is that, I think you as a person, but also in terms of the movement and the organization, address what some people have identified as a weakness of historically when we've talked about Black power, which is this issue of inclusivity, right? And whether that's in a sense of like coalitions, like you've got a whole chapter where you talk about coalitions and alliances, but also, and perhaps more importantly, inclusivity within Black folk, right? And whether that's by gender, by identity, by disability, socioeconomic status, recognizing that if Black power is to mean something, then we all got to be included in that. Talk to me a little bit about just like how that's developed in your thinking, right? But where do you think we are with that right now? Like, we're, as a movement, as we're thinking about Black power, like, where are we on this scale of narrow definition, right, of who Black power is for versus the other end of the spectrum where we really need to be? Where are we on that spectrum?
Well, I'll say that, how that developed for me was through personal experience. I mean, as a young organizer, I found myself in Black spaces where I was one of the only. And I felt weird about that because I also grew up in communities that did not look like me. And I was used to being one of the only, but I expected that when I came to my folk, right, that I wasn't going to be one of the only. And, I tell a story in the book about being in this meeting that I was so excited about. It was like a Black unity meeting at a large radical convening. And I got into this meeting and I looked around the room and it was all brothers over the age of like 60. And there was like less than a handful of sisters. And as I looked around, there was like a couple people that I knew who I knew were queer, but like not many. And I felt like we were the exception to the rule. Like we had been allowed to participate, but not that we were expected to be there. And I remember asking this question in the meeting after a long soliloquy by a brother who I love, but he could talk, honey. And he was talking and talking, and he talked for about 20 minutes. And then after he was done, I was like, okay, that's cool. I'm with that. But also, where do I fit in that vision? Because I'm down to do the work. I'm here, right? And I done sat through this 20-minute soliloquy. So clearly I'm in it, right? But you're not giving me any kind of vision for what it looks like for me to be here too. And I'm down to fight for you, but frankly, the way I think people are, human beings, we're in it for ourselves first and foremost, right? We put on our own oxygen mask. And then once we can breathe, right, we want to make sure you can breathe too, because we understand the feeling of breath. So I don't want to feel that way anymore. And I think when we created BLM, there was an intentional focus on that. And we've gotten a lot of blowback for it, whether it be people who are using right-wing talking points, right, around identity politics is killing the movement, or whether it be folk who literally are just on some like what I call like 5G logic, right? Where it's like the Black family is the nuclear family and it's a Black man and a Black woman and the man it's like, yo, our families have never been like that precisely because of white supremacy. We were never allowed to define our families for ourselves, and we were not allowed to build family, right? That was outside of the boundaries of these rules that had been imposed upon us. And of course, we have always done whatever we needed to do to create family however we could. But that's our resistance legacy. And when we talk like that, I feel like we're throwing our legacy in the garbage. We know a lot about what it means to build community under any circumstances, wherever we are. How dare us limit our own practice of reimagining rules that weren't made for us in the first place? And now instead, what we want to do is just overlay it with black, some rules that didn't work for us in the first place. But when you make it black, suddenly it works. No, that's not how this goes. So there's some of it. And then I think, I'll be honest with you, things have changed a lot. Things have changed a lot. So how do I know that? I still maintain my relationships with OGs, even though we don't agree on everything. And, what I find is that the OGs want to talk to me all the time about how their consciousness has grown around making sure that none of us get left behind. The OGs want to talk to me about how they're making sure that the leadership in their organizations look different now. How they're investing in different ones of us that they wouldn't have thought to do 20 years ago. That's important. And of course, we're still in a process of change. And so there's a way in which, right, we've lost some of the ability to articulate why our experiences matter beyond quote unquote identity. So what we don't want to do is the thing where it's like everything black is good, everything queer is good. I mean, we have Caitlyn Jenner running for governor of California. Caitlyn Jenner is a trans woman who is not going to be good for my state. And I don't care if you trans or not. It's just, that's not it. That's not the hit. So I think the next level that we have to get to, and we're not here yet, but I believe we will get there, is when we put people in the pathway of power, whether it be the vice president, the president, our city council person, a mayor, whoever it is. We can't rest on, well, they're black and we're going to support the black person. No. We want to support black people who have a progressive vision for what black communities deserve and how we can reimagine the rules that have governed our communities for a long time. And if we're not doing that, then we're not actually building black power. What we're doing is building white power and we're putting a black face on it. And those are different things.
Mm-hmm. Very different things indeed. You talk about the black vision, right? And to what extent we're working towards the black vision. And I know that's a big part of the work of Black Futures Lab, right? That, in order for us to define this vision or to define this agenda, crazy thought, we actually need to talk to our folks and find out what folks are thinking and wanting. And
wild thoughts.
Crazy, right? Crazy idea, right? Oh, so talk to me a little bit about, the work of Black Futures Lab and how you see that playing into building Black power.
The Black Futures Lab is my baby. And it is a culmination, I think, of lessons that I've learned over the last 20 years of organizing. And there's something in here for me about things that I think are possible for us, that if we actually invested in those things, it would open up new opportunities for us to make new mistakes instead of the same old, same old. So what we do at the lab is we work to make Black people powerful in politics so we can be powerful in the rest of our lives. And how we do that is we collect recent and relevant data about who we are and what we experience every day and what we want for our futures. There's all these polls out there that say, okay, Black people want this. I'm like, well, who did you talk to? Right? Who did you talk to? Which Black people? Because we know that we're not all the same. But when it comes to the white chattering class, there's an assumption, right? That one Black person speaks for all Black people. And as long as you know one Black, then you're good. You ain't got to do no more work. And to that end, we did a project called the Black Census, which is the largest survey of Black people in America in 156 years. It's the largest survey of Black people done since Reconstruction.
Wow.
And what we learned was twofold. I mean, we learned a ton about what we experience every day, what we care about. And we talked to Black folks in all 50 states from every demographic you can think of. And what we were looking for was, where is the synergy, even in the difference? And the most common thing that we heard across the board was, nobody ever asks me what I think or what I want. Everybody is telling me what I think, telling me what I want. That has disastrous impacts on democracy. The other thing that felt really important was that there was a lot of synergy, even across difference. And a lot of that has to do with, no matter your socioeconomic status, no matter your gender, no matter your geography, White supremacy organizes our lives in such a way where there's a ceiling that we can never break. And so it made sense to me then that the number one issue that across demographic people said kept them up at night was low wages that were not enough to support a family. Second was, lack of access to affordable and quality healthcare. Third was lack of access to affordable and quality housing. And you'll be surprised to know, Cliff, that, criminal system reform wasn't even in the top 5. So when you're in election cycles, right, the way candidates come to our communities is they want to talk about mass incarceration, and that's all good, but there's a whole bunch of stuff that happens before that that could prevent that, right, if we were paying attention to it. So we use that data, one, to help our communities enrich and advance their own campaigns, right? So we spent the money, we invested to get that data so people can use it, right? So it's not rhetoric that our communities are falling behind. Here's the data. But the other thing we do with it, Cliff, is that we use it to design good public policy that impacts Black people positively. And so we've done things like put out a Black agenda for 2020, which looked at the kind of core findings from the Black census and turned it into a legislative roadmap for how we make Black Lives Matter from City Hall to Congress. We also put out a COVID-19 relief and recovery plan for Black America, looking at, that data and also looking at, what our communities needed specifically to be able to recover, not from our first crisis, right, but from a deep one. We also use that information, right, and have used it to be able to design what we called a Build Back Bolder agenda, which is a Black mandate for the Biden-Harris administration. We were concerned that, in their first 100 days, that they were looking at racial justice as a separate issue than climate justice or, economic recovery or COVID-19 relief and recovery. But you can't have any of those recoveries if you don't have racial justice. And
Right,
so
right.
what we did was we worked to reshape their agenda and said, hey, actually, we're not popping y'all just for the sake of popping you. We're saying there's a better way to do it that's going to have greater and more impactful effects. So let's do it that way. And we also have done the work that we need to be able to use those agendas to decide who are we going to back and support. So when we do endorsement meetings on our C4 and our PAC side, we don't do generic questions about where do you stand on this, where do you stand on that. We actually make people go through the agenda. Where do you stand on these issues? And I can tell you, when we did that in the presidential election, we ended up with Elizabeth Warren, and I'll tell you why. She wrote an additional 26 pages of policy that she thought would also move Black communities forward. I mean, that's
So
the kind
she
of
got a plan for that.
need. Exactly. So we do that work, one, because we want to make sure that we are thinking about what are the new rules, right? Not the new concessions, but the new rules that can organize our lives. We also work with Black celebrities, entertainers, influencers, athletes to use their platforms of millions of people to talk about politics and not just products. We understand that grassroots organizing is slow and steady work, and it's important work. And there are millions of people that we are not touching because we can't. Right? We can't in the pace and the scale that we need to. And so what we do is we try to find places where our people are already aggregated and make sure that the messengers on those platforms are engaging our people in the issues that are shaping our lives. We're not saying don't sell Nikes, although don't sell Nikes. But what we are saying is if you fit to sell Nikes, you also need to be talking to people about voting rights. You also need to be talking to people about healthcare. And those things can coexist, right? We are multifaceted and we can walk and chew gum at the same time. And then finally, what we do at the lab is we invest in our communities to be powerful, whether that's the Black to the Future Public Policy Institute, where we train our people how to write, win, and implement policy in cities and states, or whether that be our work to educate and motivate and activate Black voters. We make sure, right, that our communities have an institution that we can depend on to help us make sense of the chaos that the conservative movement has created and, frankly, the liberal establishment has created for our communities. And what we hope to do, right, is not just to understand it, but to reimagine it and transform it.
I'm going to try to be respectful of time because I have one question left. But as you were talking, another question came to my mind, and I'm really just formulating it. So it may not come out all that artful, but you were talking about, that we can't do everything, right?
Right.
And as you were talking, literally 2 or 3 different competing thoughts were coming in my mind. One was your chapter talking about imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
The other was just from probably personal experience, reflecting on how do you and then the other thing that made me think of this extra question is that as you were talking about the things that you did with what you all did with Black Futures Lab, it struck me that in many ways that was a direct response to some of the things that you mentioned in the book that you felt that you did not do, that like La BLM did not do in 2016, right? In terms of not just confronting the candidates, but like having a specific agenda, right? And so as you were talking, I'm thinking that's what Black Futures Lab and that's what the agenda was, Build Back Bolder. And so all of those thoughts were going through my mind as I started thinking about this. How do you deal with that feeling of what we can't do or what we haven't done, or just from a personal perspective, right? Because sometimes I wake up and deal with this, like, oh my God, this campaign is going down, and I just feel like if we just did a better video, if we just did a better text message, if we did bigger, if we somehow got people more excited, how do you deal with that piece of knowing that you're not the end all be all, but like fighting that feeling of, there's just so much more I could have done.
Yeah. Well, the first thing is just acknowledging it, right? And I think one of the things that deeply impacted me in 2016 was feeling like I had to pop people because, I remember this conversation I had with a white labor leader after the 2016 election. And he sat in my face and said, well, if only BLM had endorsed Hillary Clinton, we wouldn't be in this position. And I remember turning to him and being like, how the fuck did you come to that? You know what I'm saying? Like, that's your grand conclusion? Like, actually,
right.
There's not enough.
And how much did you get paid? How much did you get paid in consultant fees to come up with that analysis?
It was like, there was not enough Black voters to actually impact that outcome like that. And I don't know what you think, but that sounds crazy to me. But I was constantly having to do that. And a lot of us were. I felt like I was constantly having to defend things on principle as opposed to on politics. And that's because I was defending things to people who were not our friends and who did not have our best interests at heart. And there are conversations that we need to have amongst us that are not for the public. And so the first thing I think I have to do and had to do was to acknowledge it and say, God, when all that went away, I was like, this is not how this thing should have gone. And now that I can say it, the pressure's out of the valve. But all that time, Cliff, like part of what I was doing to keep myself sane was like taking notes on how I would do it differently the next time, knowing that we were kind of where we were and there was not going to be a turning of the tide in that moment, but that eventually a moment would come where we'd be able to have a rematch. And so for me, from 2016 on, I just kept thinking to myself, when we have a rematch, you got to be ready. You got to be ready. It's okay to not have done it all. And there's a lot of good reasons why you didn't do it. But if you have a next time, you better do it right. So there's that part. And then the other piece.
And we did.
We did. We sure did. I mean, the second piece of it, though, is, and this is something that I found was really helpful last year. It was finding a lane and getting in it and staying in it and doing it excellently. I did not feel in 2020 like we had to be doing everything, because what I knew was that the punch we needed to land was very specific and narrow to what we could do. And if I thought that other people could do it, you know what I'm saying? Like I would have left that for something else. We are a movement. And in a movement, everybody cannot do everything. For a movement to be effective, we have to cover a lot of ground. And that means everybody's got to figure out what they're really good at and throw down on that. So here's what that meant. Like for my team, we weren't doing a lot of protesting. We weren't doing a lot of like getting people out into the streets. That's not what we were up to. We were doing a lot of voter registration. We were doing a lot of voter education. We were doing a lot of voter conversations and motivation work and a lot of voter turnout. That was our lane. And we were specifically talking to Black folks, nobody else. And there were lots of things that could have been done, right? And there was a lot of things we said no to. For me personally, a lot of the thing I would say to my team is don't get enamored with this BLM stuff. That's that. And it's going to come up again and again and again. My phone is blowing up off the hook, but don't you get distracted, right? That's not that. People rediscovering Black Lives Matter is not our ministry, right? Our people aren't discovering BLM for the first time. So let's make sure that we're on point with what we're talking to our folks about and what we're spending our time on. And then the third thing, honestly, is we had to not be afraid to keep taking risks, even though there were some times, right, where our own folks weren't supportive of what we were trying to do. And what I've learned is when people hate on you, it's because they're afraid of what they can't accomplish. Like, and I know y'all experience this, right? Like people, it's sometimes it's well-intentioned, sometimes it's like Fed stuff, other times it's something in between. But at the end of the day, there's always going to be somebody telling you what you can't do. And so the only way to deal with that is just to do it anyway. I have a girlfriend who, she's like a big exerciser and I'm not an exerciser and I'm starting to do it, but not, because I'm trying to keep my anxiety down, not because I'm trying to lose weight. I said, well, girl, like, she smokes cigarettes too and she drinks, she parties. So I said, how do you do that? How do you get up after we've been up kicking it and you go for like a 5-mile run? And she goes, you just do. You just do. Like, yeah, it sucks. I'm not going to tell you it doesn't suck, but you just do it. You just keep doing it and eventually it's done. And then you feel really good that despite everything, you still did it. So that I think would be my lever there. And then the last thing, surround yourself with people who believe it's possible. I don't deal with people who always have something to say about how it can't be done. I don't deal with the yeah buts, well, yeah, but it's, okay, all right. Yes, that's the world we live in, but nothing has ever been accomplished with the people who tell you it can't happen. So surround yourself with people who are dreamers like you, who are creators, who are innovators, who are experimenters. It's a qualification to actually work at the lab that you have to be comfortable. You have to be comfortable in not knowing a thing or not being fully sure how it's going to work out. We test for that when we hire people. We don't want folks in the team that can't sit in that uncertainty. Life is uncertain.
I need that test.
You know what I'm saying? We'll pass it. Life is uncertain. Life is right. Uncertain. And the only way that we get to certainty is building power. So there's that on that.
I've got one last question, and we can try to make it as quick as you want to, but I got to ask this because it's so important. We talk about Black power or power in general, right? We talk about, even philanthropy is talking about, oh, we want to invest in power building and all that. But there's this question of like, how do we know that we're getting there? Right? Like, how do we, and there's the traditional ways. We won an election. Great. Yeah. Right. Yeah. We won a ballot initiative. Great. Yeah. Right. More people turned out. Right. Yeah. Yeah. But what are the non-traditional ways that when you up late at night and you're really reflecting on, I know it's working. Like what is it that lets you know that we're getting closer to Black power?
I know that we're getting closer to Black power when the same old wedges don't work with us. I'm thinking about, for example, all the conversation that's happening around Palestine right now. I'm thinking about all the conversations that are happening around policing right now. I mean, we know that we're powerful when we have established the cornerstones of the stories and the messages that get told about our fights. And when we're not being gaslit, right, around what's going on around us and how we know it. I had a friend today send me it was like a feature on PBS, and the feature was, let me pull this up so I can name it correctly because it was really wild. I was like, oh no, this is out of style actually right now. 10 Rules of Survival If Stopped by the Police.
Wow.
and,
Wow.
and I said, this is so interesting to me. This would have made me really mad 10 years
Mm-hmm.
ago. But now I'm like, oh, no, no, no. You're just behind.
Right.
You're just behind. You haven't caught up to where we are.
Mm-hmm.
And that is how I know that we are building power. The other way I know that we are building power is when we're not fighting each other for access and visibility, but
Mm-hmm.
instead we're just
Mm-hmm.
making room for everybody. And the other way I know that we are building power is when we are experimenting with what it means to govern. You know, I'm old enough in this work to remember, right? You know, what it was like when Chokwe was
Mm-hmm.
elected Mayor
Mm.
Jackson. I'm old enough to remember that, right?
Right.
And it was an
Right.
aberration. That was an aberration. We were like, oh, he gonna be
Mm-hmm.
out in about a year because they're gonna take his ass out. We
Mm.
already know Mississippi ain't finna play. You know what I
Right.
mean?
Right.
And like,
Right.
look where we are. Look where we
Right.
are. And actually, we can see examples of that still in small form, but across the country, we're starting to see places where folk are taking seriously the process and the potential of what it means, not just to be in positions of power, but to provide for everyone. What does that look like? What does it look like to make sure that poverty is being eradicated? What does it look like to make sure everybody has water access? What does it look like to make sure that we're collecting trash in a place, right? Like that is the funky, ugly work of governance, but it's also in a lot of ways the most important, where we figure out equitable distribution of resources for everybody. So that's how we know, right? Is when we're starting to actually dive into that in a way where we're not scared of being powerful because power has been so corrosive. We are building the kind of infrastructure we need to guard against that and to experiment and innovate on what our new society and our new economy and our new democracy can and should feel and look like in real time.
That is a perfect place to end. What you were just talking about made me think of a line in one of my favorite movie, Battle of Algiers, where
Yeah.
they say it's hard to start a revolution. It's even harder to win one, but the hardest part comes after you've won it.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
And actually making that vision come to life.
That's
So
absolutely right.
thank you. Thank you so
Thank
much. I know we went a little
you.
over time, but thank
No,
you
this
so
was so
much, Alicia
good.
Garza. This has been perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate you.
And now, this week's Cliff Note. There's been a lot of talk lately about critical race theory. You got a lot of states, dozens of states across the country, which are actually going as far as to pass laws saying that you can't teach critical race theory in the public schools. To a certain extent, I almost don't want to do a Cliff Note on this because, it's so ridiculous, as if that there are actually public schools, kindergarten, elementary schools, and middle schools that are actually trying to teach critical race theory. For the most part, you don't get introduced to it, if at all, in your life, maybe during graduate school, depending on the school that you go to, maybe as an undergraduate, right? Certainly not too many high schools, and certainly nothing underneath that, right? So what's this really about? Well, to a certain extent, it's not a new argument, right? I've been seeing this. I'm a graduate. One of my graduate degrees is actually in Africana studies. So I'm old enough to remember the debates that we had around multiculturalism back in the early 90s. And you heard some of the same arguments that you were hearing then, you're hearing now. There's not enough space to teach all this. It's too dangerous to teach all this, that it's not fair. It's too slanted. And how are young white children going to feel if you have the audacity to actually teach the truth about history, to teach the truth about structural racism, to teach the truth about how the land was stolen from indigenous people, to teach the truth about slavery and so on and so on? How are young white folks going to feel? How's the young white college student going to feel if you teach all of this, right? You're going to make them feel too bad. Now, there's a lot of ways that we can address this, but one of the ways that's often missed is the reality that in not teaching it, you're having a damaging effect on young folks, except it's not the white folks, right? It's not the white student. It's the black and the brown and the other students that are in the class that so often are struggling with the fact that either they don't see themselves in history, or the ways that we see ourselves in the history is painful, right? And then we have to deal with the fact that when we look around each other without having that history, without having an understanding of Jim Crow and structural racism, without that understanding, we're then presented with the statistics and sometimes with the reality that depicts our lives a certain way. And we're left to wonder, well, why is it the young Black student or the young brown student that are left to wonder, why is it that their families or their neighborhoods don't have as much wealth as other folks? Why is it that we're not in as many position of powers? Why is it that there's this statistic and COVID is hitting us this way and so on and so forth? And so when you don't teach, whatever you call it, critical race theory, multiculturalism, or how about we just call it the truth? How about we just call it true and real history? When you don't teach that, you're having an impact on Black students all across the country that nobody really wants to talk about. That's the reality. And then not only are we left with the impacts of the situation, the socioeconomic situations in our communities, and that impact, we're also left with the impact that it has on our perceptions of our own value and our worth and our own power. That's what's really at stake here. Because as somebody once said, education serves one of two purposes, either to liberate or to oppress. As Carter G. Woodson once said, when you control a man's thinking or when you control a woman's thinking, you don't have to worry about his or her actions. You don't have to tell them to stay here or go yonder. They'll seek their proper place, right? Because their education makes it so. Education serves one of two purposes, either to liberate or to oppress. And that's all about power. I'm Cliff. Y'all join us next week.
This is the hour we stand. This is the hour we fight. Not the hour for cowards. Time to fight for our rights. And I ain't running no more. I'm standing 10 toes down. Too much at stake right now. It's just blood in the ground. Pick a side. No more. Straddling the fist. You either hot or cold. You either bashful or bold. Brother Cliff, DVM. Best believe that I've been listening. The rebirth of a movement. Black power. Revisit. What?